You know, one of the most interesting subplots this year to the season of the San Francisco 49ers was the change at quarterback from Alex Smith to Colin Kaepernick. And it kind of, makes you reminisce on some great quarterback controversies. You think of what other great situations happened where one guy was benched for another guy and did it A, succeed, or B, did it falter. But there are so many situations where a lot of teams have two quarterbacks on the roster that are capable of doing the job, and it's tough to decide which one to go with. Or you have no quarterback, and you're just picking a guy that thinks gives you the least likely chance of losing, as is the Arizona Cardinals this year with John Skelton, Kevin Kolb, and Ryan Lindley. But anyways, I figured I would give the fans here my list of the top 10 greatest quarterback controversies. Not just in the NFL, but in NFL history. And I'm going to start at the bottom up, because you got so many on this list. And to start off, I'm going to go at number 10. My number 10 would have to be Steve Walsh versus Troy Aikman. Now, a lot of people fail to remember that Troy Aikman was drafted number 1 overall in the 1989 NFL Draft by the Dallas Cowboys. That was the first year Jimmy Johnson and Jerry Jones together took over the organization from Tom Landry and Tex Schramm. And it was not a pretty season. They went 1-15. And were one of the worst teams in NFL history. But kind of, involved in that season was the fact that Troy Aikman was doing battle with a supplemental draft pick in Steve Walsh. Now, Steve Walsh was the quarterback at the University of Miami where Jimmy Johnson won a national title. So he felt comfortable with Walsh and tried to bring him in. And I think it was to light a fire under Troy Aikman. But anyways, Aikman took a pounding his rookie year. He took a pounding. I mean, that was the time in the NFC East where you had pass rushers, like Charles Mann for the Redskins, Lawrence Taylor for the Giants. For the Eagles, you had Reggie White, Clyde Simmons, Jerome Brown. He had so many players back then that knew how to hit the quarterback, and Aikman just got the hell beat out of him his first year in the league. Now, there were games where Aikman missed, wasn't able to go because he got the hell beat out of him, and Steve Walsh had to step in. Steve Walsh was a good quarterback, but he wasn't a guy that could really, make some throws that Aikman could. I mean, Jimmy Johnson, the coach at that time, was actually very close to starting Troy Aikman. But they were very close to starting, Steve Walsh over Troy Aikman, and there were people that said, Jimmy, you can't do that, they'll burn your house down. So he goes with Aikman the whole year, but Aikman misses a few games and Steve Walsh has to play. And the only win for the Cowboys that year was a victory over the Washington Redskins, and in that game, Steve Walsh completed 10 of 30 passes. The end result was that Steve Walsh was dumped at the end of the season, and Troy Aikman would go on to lead the Cowboys to 3 Super Bowls in his tenure there. And ultimately, Steve Walsh becomes a journeyman who really doesn't amount to much in the grand scheme of things. And he kind of bounces around the league. Pretty much just does his thing. And really, doesn't seem to catch on much with anybody. And I would have to go up there and say that it's probably, a good thing that Troy Aikman ended up being the guy in Dallas, because you look what happened. I mean, they would draft Emmitt Smith, they already had Michael Irvin, they'd get a whole bunch of players, and they'd become a dynasty. So Aikman won, rightfully so. My number 9 controversy involves my favorite player. in NFL history. Drew Brees versus Philip Rivers. Now, in 2001, in the second round of the draft, the San Diego Chargers took Drew Brees, who was a quarterback out of Purdue, who was third in the Heisman Trophy voting, was not a really big guy, had a great career at Purdue. And Brees, quite frankly, as much as I love him, he struggled his first 3 years in San Diego. And that prompted them with the first overall pick in the NFL draft in 2004 to take Eli Manning. But since Eli didn't want to play for San Diego, Philip and Eli were both swapped. The Giants got Manning, and Philip Rivers went to San Diego. Now, Philip Rivers held out in training camp, and Drew Brees used it as an opportunity to more or less seize control of the team. Not so much by more or less seizing it, but just by being the guy, like working his ass off and getting himself in the best possible shape and becoming the leader of that football team. And damn it, he did. He had one of his best years that year, throwing 27 touchdowns and a mere 7 interceptions in his first Pro Bowl appearance. They would lose in the first round of playoffs to the New York Jets, and a lot of people were thinking, well, what's Philip Rivers going to serve? Because Drew Brees is still a young guy. He's in his early 20s. Will Philip even get a chance to play at all? Well, in 2005, Drew Brees has another very good year, throws 24 touchdowns and 15 picks. But in the season finale against the Denver Broncos, Brees is lost for the shoulder injury. Now, the injury would be a rotator cuff injury that would end up, rotator cuff that would end up sidelining him, obviously for the rest of the game, but pretty much for a long time. And San Diego wasn't sure what to do. They had Rivers on the roster. What are they going to do? So they end up cutting Drew Brees, and they go with Philip Rivers. Brees gets healthy and signs a 6-year, $60 million deal with the Saints. And look what he's done in New Orleans since then. I mean, the numbers that Drew Brees has put up since he went to New Orleans is staggering. He's got two of the three highest passing yardage totals in NFL history. I'm going to give you these numbers as a Saint. 2,910 completions, 4,340 attempts for 67% completion percentage, 33,571 yards, 244 touchdowns against 112 picks, pass rating of 98.2. Nobody has more yards or touchdown passes during that span. And he did it in 111 games, which means he's averaging 302 yards a game, and he has been awesome. He's been, in my opinion, aside from hiring head coach Sean Payton, the sole reason the Saints dug themselves out of the jam they were in for how many years. Now, Philip Rivers becomes the quarterback in San Diego and has some very, very good seasons and leads the team to a conference championship game, leads the team to a few appearances in the divisional round of the playoffs. Ultimately, Pittsburgh and New England would prove to be some tough obstacles to overcome. But since 2010, after the 2009 season, they made the playoffs going 13-3. But since then, they have not made the playoffs since, and Philip Rivers has regressed every year. Meanwhile, Drew Brees is continuing to put up numbers that are just staggering, and the way he's been playing is just been unbelievable. Ultimately, I thought that the New Orleans Saints got the better of that deal because Brees has ultimately proven to be a much better quarterback. Number 8 was one that really could have been avoided if one or two things go differently, and that's Tom Brady versus Drew Bledsoe. Brady was a little-known 6th-round draft pick that had just come out last year. That come out the year before, in 2000, whenever the 2001 season opened. And Drew Bledsoe was firmly the starter in New England. Pro Bowls, been to a Super Bowl, he was the guy. Drew Bledsoe gets hurt against the Jets after taking a hit on the sideline from Mo Lewis. And Tom Brady steps in, and he leads the Patriots to the Super Bowl. Now, in the offseason, Bledsoe gets traded to the Bills. Has a pretty good half of the season to begin with. Doesn't play particularly well the second half of the year. Makes a few Pro Bowl appearances while there. But look what Tom Brady did in New England when he was gone. Brady's been first team All-NFL in 2007, 2010. Had a 50-touchdown season in 2007. Had a season where he threw 36 touchdowns and 4 picks in 2010. Been everything they ever could have asked for. I mean, he was much better than Bledsoe. I mean, lowly touted 6th-round pick. Drew Bledsoe, the number 1 overall pick, and Brady outdoes it. It's a David and Goliath story right there. Number 7 is one that was kind of short-lived, and that was Doug Williams and Jay Schroeder for the Redskins. Now, it really started in 1985, when on Monday night against the New York Giants, Redskins Pro Bowl quarterback and Super Bowl winning quarterback Joe Theismann, who'd been an MVP in the NFL, broke his leg and ended his career. In comes Jay Schroeder. Now, big guy, strong arm, pretty good quarterback. But on the roster as a backup was Doug Williams. You know, a backup who'd been through adversity, was drafted by the hopeless Bucks in the late 70s, was a pretty good quarterback and made the Pro Bowl after the 79 season. But a few years later, he wasn't given the contract he really deserved, and the Bucks pretty much just got rid of him. Even though he was a really good player and could have potentially led that franchise to a couple of conference title games, that's how good he was. But at that point in his career, the consensus was he was practically done. So he goes to Washington a few years later, after playing in the USFL, and then the USFL folds. He sits behind Jay Schroeder. Schroeder gets hurt, and in comes Doug Williams at the start of the 87 season. Williams eventually, he and Schroeder kind of go back and forth because of their injuries or inconsistent play. There were games Williams wouldn't even dress. There were games he would start. Ironically enough, when games that Jay Schroeder started and Doug Williams finished, Williams was undefeated. But anytime Doug Williams started, he lost. But going into the playoffs at the end of the regular season, Joe Gibbs, the coach at that time, decides to go with Doug Williams as the starter. And he played phenomenal in the playoffs, including a 4-touchdown performance in Super Bowl 22 against the Denver Broncos, including putting up 5 touchdowns in the second quarter alone for 35 points and winning the MVP in a 42-10 blowout. And after that, Jay Schroeder really wasn't heard much from in Washington again. A few years later, he would be on the Oakland Raiders roster. He would make a Pro Bowl, but Doug Williams wouldn't last much longer either. So neither guy really won that one. Number 6 on my list is Terry Bradshaw versus Joe Gilliam. Now, when Bradshaw was drafted number 1 overall, at the start of the 1970 NFL Draft, after a coin flip with the Bears, Bradshaw was horrible as a rookie and horrible his first 4 years in the league. Well, not horrible his first 4. He had a couple of okay seasons. But Joe Gilliam was a backup on the roster, and at the time was the NFL's first successful black quarterback. And in the 74 preseason, the Steelers went undefeated. And Gilliam played very, very well. And Bradshaw really didn't. So at the start of that season, Gilliam was named the starter. But halfway through the season, he started off the season strong at a couple of very, very good performances at the start of the 74 year, but after a while, his style of play, throwing it pretty much willy-nilly, didn't sit well with Chuck Noll, the coach, and their run-first philosophy, and he was benched. They played Terry Bradshaw for a few games. Bradshaw ends up playing a few, doesn't play much better, and he gets benched for a backup out of Notre Dame who was drafted in 69, who really wasn't any good, and Terry Hanratty. Terry Hanratty started 1 game that year, and that was against the Browns. The Steelers won the game in Cleveland, but Terry Hanratty completed 2 passes. Yes, I repeat that. Completed 2 passes. And 3 interceptions. But after that, Bradshaw was brought back off the bench, inserted as the starter, and the rest is history. Hell, they won 4 rings in 6 years. Joe Gilliam unfortunately passed away years later, but Terry Bradshaw proved that he was the starter, he was better than Joe Gilliam, and he ultimately deserved to be the quarterback of that team. That's halfway through the list right now. Number 5 on my list is Phil Simms, Jeff Hostetler. Now, the background on this story is kind of interesting because Phil Simms was definitely the starter of the team. I mean, if you look at a talent evaluation, Phil Simms was much better than Jeff Hostetler. I mean, he won a Super Bowl MVP, completing a record 22-25 passes for a completion percentage of 88%. And not so many people give Jeff Hostetler a chance, but he was a pretty good quarterback when he was at West Virginia. But Phil Simms was the starter in that team for forever, from 86 to 90. And 3/4 of the way through the 1990 season, the Giants are 12-1. And Phil Simms gets hurt against the Buffalo Bills, and then comes Hostetler. Hostetler, everybody said he was a backup that couldn't do it, and all he did was lead the Giants through the playoffs to a huge upset in the NFC title game at San Francisco over the two-time defending champion 49ers and MVP Joe Montana, quarterback. Then in the Super Bowl, they beat the 6-point favorite Buffalo Bills due to large part to Scott Norwood's missed field goal at the end of the game. So at this point, Hostetler was not the MVP of the Super Bowl. Otis Anderson was. But Phil Simms and Jeff Hostetler were both Super Bowl champions. And so what was the aftermath? I don't know. After the 1990 season, who will be a future Hall of Fame coach, Bill Parcells, retired after winning 2 Super Bowls with the team. And the Giants pretty much never figured out a plan. And Hostetler started the majority of the games that season, but head coach Ray Handley, who'd just taken over for Parcells, they never figured out a system. They never figured out which quarterback to choose, and ultimately neither Simms nor Hostetler appeared in a Super Bowl again. Simms would finish his career in '93 with the Giants. Hostetler would go to Oakland after the '92 season, play a few years there, and reach a Pro Bowl after the 1994 season. So really nobody won there. The fourth one on our list is Rob Johnson and Doug Flutie up in Buffalo. Rob Johnson passes the eye test of a starting quarterback, but he's got 2 big flaws. Arrogant, and his nickname was Robo-Sack. And his nickname was Robo-Sack because he gets sacked more than any quarterback in NFL history. His percentage is just preposterous of how many times he got sacked. You have Doug Flutie, little backup, Heisman Trophy winner when he was at Boston College, small guy, athletic, team leader, people loved him, super competitive. If you wanted all the intangibles, Doug Flutie's the guy. But because Rob Johnson had one great game in 97 as the quarterback for the Jaguars, the Bills traded for him and made him a $25 million contract without even playing a game. Now, Rob Johnson was not particularly good as the starting quarterback. I mean, he would go on to win a Super Bowl as a backup in Tampa in '02, but Doug Flutie was ultimately the better guy. I mean, they brought in Flutie as insurance, but Rob Johnson, spent a lot of time hurt because he got sacked a lot. When Flutie played well. But, it was almost a back and forth of who you want. Do you want the leader, the smaller guy, or do you want the guy who passes the eye test and isn't really, as much of a team guy as you would think? So in '99, Johnson gets hurt, and Flutie starts most of the year. Flutie makes a Pro Bowl, and the Bills are in the playoffs. The Bills, prior to the playoff game against the Titans, decide to start Rob Johnson over Doug Flutie, which is a dumb idea. Because think about it. Flutie's your guy. Why change now what's working for you? They ended up losing that game, which was the Music City Miracle game, in which they had the lateral with like less than 20 seconds remaining. The Titans did to win it. But the next year, Flutie was cut, and then a year after that, Rob Johnson went. So really, nobody really nobody really won that quarterback controversy. It was more or less one mired in inconsistent play from one guy and a lack of people believing in the other. To move on, the next quarterback controversy is one from the 50s. Back when the Rams were in LA, they had two Hall of Fame quarterbacks, Norm Van Brocklin and Bob Waterfield. It was funny because both these guys were Hall of Famers, both these guys in their prime. You couldn't pick a winner. You had Bob Waterfield, who was your leader, who had won an NFL championship his rookie year, something only he and Sammy Baugh did in either the NFL or championship or Super Bowl era. And you have Norm Van Brocklin, the Dutchman, the man who holds the record for most passing yards in a single game with over 550. And the situation was that Van Brocklin, the Dutchman, not a whole lot of people had a really high opinion on him as a person, but as a player, there was almost nobody better. And the only reason he accepted being on the same team and co-quarterbacking with Waterfield is because he understood how good Waterfield was. And regardless of how the game was going, they would change every quarter. Waterfield play a quarter, Van Brocklin play a quarter. You know? I mean, Bob Waterfield would end up retiring a few years after they picked up Brocklin. But Brocklin would have a really good career and would end up finishing his career in 1960 as a member of the Eagles, winning an NFL title over the Packers. There really wasn't a clear-cut winner in this quarterback controversy because both guys were so good. Both guys were awesome. And Hall of Fame quarterbacks, it's the only controversy on this list so far that has had two Hall of Fame quarterbacks. Number 2 on the list is one that a lot of people can make an argument for number 1. And that's Roger Staubach and Craig Morton. I shouldn't say prior, actually. During the 1970 season, Craig Morton was the starter. He was what Tom Landry, the head coach, wanted. A true drop-back passer, execute the play as it's drawn up, and don't make any variations. You had Roger Staubach, though, who had been drafted out of Navy in the 10th round in 1969, who he, of course, had to give a few years to the military before he could play any football. When he came back, I mean, he wasn't, a typical drop-back passer at all. He was Captain America. He'd run a lot, use his legs. Pretty good. He had a very good arm, but he was noted for using his legs and improvising, something that Landry, it really kind of frustrated Landry, I think, early on because he didn't know how to coach him. And I think he went with Morton early on because of that. But anyways, after the 1970 season, the Cowboys reached Super Bowl V against the Baltimore Colts. And what became known as the Blunder Bowl, which had countless turnovers and stupid blunders from not just the players, but from the coaches and from the people who organized the game. The Blunder Bowl. Yeah. Anyways, the Cowboys lose that game to the Colts 16-13 in the last second field goal. Now, early on in the 71 season, the Cowboys are iffy. They're not doing very well. I think they're starting off 4-3. And Tom Landry's going back and forth over who to start, Staubach or Morton. And he ends up starting Staubach and ends up rewarding him richly. They'd win the Super Bowl, and Staubach would be the MVP that year in the Super Bowl, 12-19 for 2 touchdowns against the Dolphins, 24-3. To this day, it's the only Super Bowl where a team did not score a touchdown, and the Dolphins didn't. Craig Morton would go along, and he would end up going to Denver and leading the Broncos to Super Bowl 12 against, you guessed it, the Dallas Cowboys. Craig Morton had a terrible performance. Roger Staubach played well, and the Cowboys won a lopsided 27-10. And what's funny was a reporter caught up and did a story talking about, this is pretty funny, how Craig Morton, when he was in the NFL, always wanted to win a Super Bowl for the Dallas Cowboys. And due to his performance yesterday, he finally did. It's pretty good. But number 1 on our list, come on, you knew it was coming. The only other quarterback controversy beside Brocklin and Waterfield to have 2 Hall of Fame quarterbacks in their prime, Steve Young, Joe Montana. You have what some people can make an argument for, maybe two of the best quarterbacks in NFL history. The consensus is Montana's the best ever. I put Unitas above anybody, including Montana, but most people's opinion is that Montana's the best to ever play, and he very well could be. And Steve Young was incredibly underrated because, it took him a while to win a Super Bowl when he took over. Montana, the 4 rings they won in the 80s. Awesome. But after the 1990 NFC Championship game, which he gets hurt in, they go Steve Young. Now, Young was a supplemental pick out of BYU by the Bucs in the mid-'80s. Bill Walsh, at the time, was a coach of the Niners, picked up Steve Young, saw the talent in him that nobody else did, and Steve Young ends up becoming a very successful backup in San Francisco. When Montana missed a lot of games because he could be very fragile at times, Steve Young would step in and, he'd lead the team to victory. He'd be very, very efficient. He was still more or less a running quarterback whenever he played. He was one of the most mobile quarterbacks ever, much more mobile than Joe. But it seemed almost like more or less he had to change positions in his mind before he could be a quarterback for the 49ers. But yeah, he was a very good quarterback, and he and Joe Montana didn't have the greatest relationship as two quarterbacks, but, they respected each other and understood the other person. But Steve Young always wanted to be the quarterback of that team. And finally, Steve Young got a chance when Montana was hurt. Now, Montana missed all of 91 and most of 92, coming back in the regular season finale for a victory. Now, Steve Young would win the MVP in 92, so after that season, which saw them lose to the Dallas Cowboys, Montana was shipped to Kansas City. Steve Young in 94 would go on to win the MVP like he did in 92 and lead the Niners to the Super Bowl over the Chargers. In that game against San Diego, he would throw 6 touchdowns, breaking a record held by, you guessed it, Joe Montana, 5 from Super Bowl 24 against the Broncos. Now, they did have a meeting head-to-head as quarterbacks. It was in 94. And it was in Kansas City, in Arrowhead Stadium. The underappreciated and underdog Kansas City Chiefs, led by Joe Montana, defeated the 49ers. I would have to go ahead and say that was a tough blow for Steve Young, but I think it provided him with a little bit of spark, a little bit of rest of the fire he needed to finally lead his team to a ring. And both quarterbacks in the Hall of Fame, both some of the best ever. You can't really, make an argument saying which guy won. Montana was winning while he had the job, while he was healthy, but, when Steve Young took over, it wasn't really like that team missed a beat. The team continued to play at a very, very high level. So it's not like one guy won and the other one didn't. So that's my list right there of the greatest quarterback controversies ever. The one that I was considering putting on the list the one you really could also make an argument for would be Kurt Warner and Mark Bolger. Because Kurt Warner had injury problems when he was at the Rams, after his 2 MVP seasons, and Bolger was a guy who'd been playing well. So they go with Bolger and dump Kurt Warner, and it didn't really go so well for him because Bolger eventually, he kind of fizzles out. And Kurt Warner would lead the Cardinals to the Super Bowl. Might as well have taken Slippery Rock, because that's pretty much what it was like. But anyways, that's my list right there. Love it or hate it. Tell me what you think. That was inspiring. I was inspired to do that because of the fact that a quarterback controversy and a change led to a team getting to the Super Bowl. One time it did do that, Baltimore, 2000, when Trent Dilfer took over for Tony Banks midway through the season. They won the last 11 games and won it all. And I can sit here and tell you to this day, as bad as quarterback Trent Dilfer was, if they don't make that change, they don't win the Super Bowl because Banks was bad. And Dilfer may not have been good, but he was good enough to lead them to a ring and not screw it up. That's all you got from me. Take care.